One of the first things that Dragon's Rising does to hook the audience is the promise of new elemental powers. This was very apparent from the first trailers where we learned about Sora being the new Master of Technology, a power that seemingly didn't exist before the merge, and throughout the first season we get introduced to a bunch of new elemental powers, like the aforementioned power of technology, the elemental power of heat, and lastly the power of fusion. For the most part, these new powers were new and fun, and the only one that you could classify as redundant is Wildfire's heat power, but it led to a really fun dynamic with Kai, so it's no biggie in my opinion. Come Season 2's Tournament of Sorcerers, we get introduced to a plethora of new elemental powers, but a lot of them were pretty redundant with stuff we'd already had, like Reflex being the Wish version of Speed, but that isn't the point I'm here to make today, because I'm almost certain it's been talked about to death by this point. While I love the Tournament of Sorcerers, a lot of its fighters haven't really been developed at all, and are essentially cardboard cutouts with elemental powers tacked onto them, and usually I wouldn't care about this sort of thing because it isn't an issue I really have with a Tournament of Elements, but there's one character that makes this issue really apparent: Raz. If you boil the character of Raz down to the most simplistic and bare bones part of his character, it's that he values strength above all and does whatever he can to get more of it. Raz feels like a natural implementation into the world of Ninjago, and while we don't know his past in any significant amount of detail, we understand even just through the way he fights that he's had his own adventures as a warrior, and has his own convictions and belief that he projects onto other people, which shape his interactions with the world and other characters. Raz feels like a warrior from another realm who's had his own experiences and adventures, and feels like a person who existed before the merge, unlike the elemental fighters who feel like powers pasted onto a character model. While Raz doesn't have an elemental power, it would have been really cool if, like him, the new elemental masters followed one of the principles of the Source Dragons, really leaning into the idea that these differing worldviews and ideologies are clashing against one another after the merge. Clashing two extremes together is already a large part of Dragon's Rising Season 2's story, and considering they tried to establish a focus versus chaos dichotomy in Season 3, it isn't just a Season 2 thing that they pulled off one time. To circle back to Tournament, basically all of the elemental masters we meet are reduced to their elemental powers despite their own diverse backgrounds. One of the tournament's biggest selling points is the fact that it's the largest elemental sporting event in history, with fighters from all across the merged lands, yet pretty much none of the fighters feel like they've had their own adventures or experiences. For example, Zoro's a Devonian prince from the First Lands, and he gets some good stuff with Wildfire, but beyond that,
there's nothing. Thank you, Shen.
We are told that he's a dangerous opponent, and how he's the biggest threat to Raz's plans aside from the ninja, but we're not really shown why. He's featured in two fights, one is rigged in his favour, and one where he loses to Frack. By the end of the tournament, I don't really think we get an impression as to why Raz took this guy so seriously and wanted him dead. It's just really strange to me that these elemental fighters who draw from different Source Dragons don't have any significant changes in fighting styles or beliefs. Throughout the tournament, the ninja keep telling us they need to abstain from using Rising Dragon technique on opponents who don't use Shatter Spin, but it would have been far more interesting if they did have to bust it out against opponents with their own fighting styles derived from their own sources. Zer defeating Zane, for example, could serve as a perfect introduction to the tournament and the threat they're facing. It would have been far more interesting if Lloyd insists that they should abstain from using Rising Dragon technique, only for Zane to go against Zer, who has presumably had 15 plus seasons worth of adventures, and gets beat fair and square, setting the stage for the challenges that lay ahead of the tournament. Moreover, the Tournament of Sorcerers had a very strange approach when it comes to older elements. Sometimes it knocks it out of the park with characters like Mr. Pale, who essentially returns for one scene, has some banter with Lloyd, and gives us a quick update on what he's been doing, and develops what his element can do. I personally have no complaints with this, and I wish Dragon's Rising used this approach for more masters, because it often feels content to throw away characters like Bolobo, Jacob, and Shade, in favour of characters like Teak and Obscuria, who will never get as figures. I think this is especially egregious with Jacob, although many of the following criticisms apply to the others as well, because he had a very cool gimmick unique to him and a perfectly good legacy design just begging to be used. Instead, sound is given to a green Kalmar who will A, never get as a figure, and B, will likely never appear again if Algo and Zara are any indication to go by. It's such a shame because we could have easily learned more about what he's been getting up to, and maybe even somehow tie him back to the Season 3 stuff about activating the Archdragon through music. It's a shame to see him and other underdeveloped masters discarded like this in favour of new masters who will also never get any substantial content. Back to the whole principles and masters point though, I have a really hard time believing that only motion and strength have techniques that lean into the extremes of their principles, and I get this is something they wouldn't necessarily have the time to flesh out in the tournament, but they had plenty of opportunities to do this in Dragon's Rising Season 3, namely with Dragon Spinjitsu and Tia. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time for the obligatory brutality mention of the video. I've brought this up on here before, but brutality really delves into Dragon Spinjitsu being the technique one can achieve after following the principles of flow, and it really ties into the history of the first realm and feels integrated into the world of Ninjago, whereas in the show, Dragon Spinjitsu is lazily tacked on, when in reality it could have been a near perfect way to address this issue, because it would have done so much to flesh out the world of Dragons Rising in a way that the show is straight up failing to do at the moment. To talk about the whole fighters in the merged lands with different principles and ideals, I want to finally touch on Tyr in depth, and get into why his mythological roots being ignored is really detrimental to his character and the world of Dragons Rising as a whole. While I know that Tyr was named after Kevin Burke's nephew, the name is still rooted in Germanic and Norse mythology, and it's something that should be talked about, since naming your character after a Norse god and drawing no inspiration from it is really baffling to me. Tyr is known for being the god of war, representing justice and order. He's most known for his story with Fenrir and Ragnarok, where he sacrifices his right hand for monstrous wolf Fenrir as a show of honour and justice, and is bitten off after Fenrir realises the gods have bound him with no intent of releasing him. Tyr meets his end during an event called the Twilight of Gods, where he and another wolf, Garmir, become each other's slayer, bringing about both their ends. All of Tyr's mythology points to him being a bringer of justice, with a strong sense of honour, willing to sacrifice himself if he believes it to be the right thing to do. It's some really interesting stuff, and Tyr has quite a lot to him, but unfortunately Dragons Rising Season 3 takes no inspiration from this, making him a generic kind leader-like character. I really wish the show took more inspiration from his mythological roots for the show, because this was the perfect way to introduce someone like Razin to the show with an entirely different set of beliefs. And while Tyr doesn't quite fall into the category of reduced to his elemental power since he doesn't have one, he still suffers from the same issue of being another cardboard cutout character with no real beliefs or ideology to contribute to the throughline Dragons Rising has about strength versus motion. Which is a real shame, because I think having a character like Tyr who draws from Norse mythology would have been really beneficial to the story and world of Dragons Rising. As is, however, I think a lot of Dragons Rising side characters feel kind of hollow, and for the most part they don't feel like they have anything to add to the world of Ninjago other than padding it out with more powers, more factions, and more Breath of the Wild-esque villagers. A lot of quote-unquote new stuff we've gotten from Dragons Rising as of late feels like it's mindlessly checking a box on lists without much further thought put behind it, if that makes any sense. New elemental powers after merge, a lot of them are just completely redundant with what we've already gotten, or in some cases are straight up nonsensical. New location for a set of mini episodes? Make it a new realm instead of fitting it into one of the realms we already had. Dragons Rising has clearly had a lot of thought put into its main story, with everything that's there being really compelling and well done in my opinion. But a lot of what surrounds it can be very murky at times, and I think a lot of the additions feel like quantity over quality, and it makes a lot of the world feel rather empty or unnecessarily redundant, overlapping with things we've already had within the world of Ninjago, except all of these redundancies are being labelled as something new and exciting when they just aren't. For a show that has such a strong opposition between strength and motion as principles, it's such a shame that the conflict between them is only really presented through the lens of our two main factions, because it would be really sick to see third parties intervening with their own ways of life and styles of fighting. The lack of involvement from these aforementioned third parties also further reinforces the notion that these characters don't exist outside of the tournament. Season 2 Part 2 goes to great lengths to set up the Devonians, but it just doesn't matter and it doesn't need to, because neither Zer nor his people show up when we visit their homeland in Season 3. Hell, we even established there's an undead elemental master, and yet he's nowhere to be seen once Raz and his company pop up in the underworld. This is particularly upsetting because it would have been so easy to throw him in as the posse that goes against Raz instead of these random skeleton guys. All of this leaves the rest of the world feeling a bit disjointed and empty in my opinion, and it's a real shame because the merged lands have so much untapped potential that I feel just isn't being used at all. I think the best way to summarize this is imagining the merged lands like a big checklist, and I feel like we're going through the merged lands at the moment like ticking boxes just to give us all the realms as quickly as possible, with as many bare bones factions and locations as possible to try and fill out the very expansive world they've given us. For example, the Land of Monsters is a completely redundant realm with a Land of Madness existing, and it just comes across as the show wanting to pad out as much of the world as possible with hollow content, giving some of the Dragons Rising world building a very quantity over quality feel to it. I don't think this applies to everything in Dragons Rising story of course, because locations like the Land of Lee, Imperium, and slowly but surely Mysterium are being fleshed out in some cool ways, but I hope that when we explore those seemingly new locations next year, we get some interesting stuff to go with them that feels substantial and doesn't feel like hollow padding to complete the world of Dragons Rising further. With all of that being said though, I think that's pretty much everything I have to say on this topic, so I want to give a massive thank you to you, the viewers, if you've watched the video up until this point, because I really appreciate all of you giving me the time of day, and I hope you enjoyed my insane rabblings. I also want to give a massive shout out to Gino for helping me out with this one. In the description and on screen now there will be a link to his socials and his Discord server for Brutality, so please go check those out if they interest you. Lastly, if you want a Discord server for more general Ninjago discussion, then feel free to join my Discord server, the Digiverse. All of the links will be in the same places, so I thank you all again so much for watching, and I will hopefully see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.
You feel tired, look at yourself.